first, we have Dr. Tommy Dolan with his talk, The Rise, Rise and Rise of Political Consensus in Northern Ireland. Dr. Tommy Dolan holds first-class undergraduate and postgraduate degrees from the University of Edinburgh. He was awarded a PhD from Edinburgh in 2016 for this, entitled Visions of History in the Thought of the Architects of Peace in Northern Ireland, Gerry Adams, John Hume and David Trimble. Currently, he has a forthcoming article in the Historical Journal entitled Maynooth, History and the Intellectual Origins of John Hume's Political Thinking. Let's all welcome Tommy.
Here, guys. Just a wee bit about Hume towards the end of the paper, but Adams and Trimble won't feature too prominently today. So, I suppose this paper almost has a unionist agenda, a unionist with a small u. It attempts to integrate Northern Ireland into the consensus politics paradigm that has been pervasive within 20th century British historiography since the publication of Paul Addison's influential The Road to 1945, the central thesis of which was that the interwar coalition government gave rise to a new political consensus between Labour and the Conservatives about the role of the state in post-war British society, a consensus which came under strain in the 1960s and which was ultimately dismantled by successive Thatcher governments. Yet to some extent what follows plays off an article by Brian Harrison, or Sir Brian Harrison, published in the journal History in 1996, where he advanced a rigorous critique of the by then orthodox consensus view. Amongst other perceived shortcomings, Brian Harrison highlighted an unduly contracted time span. Typically the focus was on the classic era of political consensus, 45 to 79, but sometimes only the so-called Butsk-like years, 51 to 64. The consensus historians' preoccupation with economic and welfare policy, and their tendency to overlook, as he put it, the persistence of dissension within consensus. Thus Harrison suggested his peers would do well to turn their attention to Northern Ireland, that historiographically neglected area. There, he insisted, and I quote, political consensus was never present. Sullen nationalist acquiescence in a unionist supremacy till the mid-1960s, then a violent eruption, then a tense and precarious standoff held apart only by Westminster's direct rule. Now, initially, one's compelled to agree with Harrison's perspective on his rather depressing summation of Northern Ireland's history. Indeed, against and largely because of the militarised situation that emerged in the region, now generally and not unproblematically referred to as the Troubles, intense scholarly conflict rather than broad consensus once even seemed to be the defining characteristic of Irish historiography. All this despite the fact that, ironically, the primary architects of the modernised incarnation of Irish history, Robert Dudley Edwards and Theodore Moody, infused it with a retrospectively optimistic consensual agenda, believing that a mode of determinedly source-based apolitical scholarship might act as a sort of intellectual balsam for a wounded and divided island society. Unsurprisingly then, and it is particularly obvious from Brian Harrison's treatment of a consensus, hitherto Northern Ireland has been effectively partitioned off from the sizeable region of British historiographical debate, and in a sense rightly so. It might also be contended, however, that Irish historians have been guilty of self-imposed exile from the idea of political consensus, given their discipline's origins in the wake of rebellion, partition, civil war, not to mention a world war, and the subsequent development of the field of Irish history in the shadow of gunmen post-68, so to speak. It's probably fair to say that Irish historians have not been predisposed to nor interested in the study of political consensus and consensual themes in a way that traditionally their British counterparts have tended to be. Of course, the inverse of this is also quite true. It's both odd and telling that Northern Ireland, typically flagged as one of the most studied areas on the planet in relation to its size, should constitute a neglected area within British historiography. Certainly a work such as Brian Harrison's Peaceable Kingdom, Stability and Change in Modern Britain seems very alien in comparison to much of the sheer mass of scholarship in Northern Ireland, if not also with respect to a good deal of the literature in modern Ireland. Furthermore, the work's central thesis that since the 17th century Britain has been a peaceable kingdom again seems to have the effect of alienating the historian of Northern Ireland, reinforcing their sense of their subject matter being somehow cast out or partitioned off from the history of a neighbouring island utopia. That is not to say that Irish historians have never been interested in consensus. Rather, it's probably true that in a strange, paradoxical way, the so-called revisionist controversy within Irish history stemmed from the fact that Irish historians have been overwhelmingly fixated with the idea of consensus, arguably far more so than British historians. Indeed, Richard Burke has gone so far as to suggest that the consensual agenda engineered by Moody and Edwards in the 30s actually constituted a perversion of a more benign reconciling tendency within Irish historiography that was in existence since at least the mid-16th century. And arguably this contradiction, an obsession with consensus to the point of conflict, is evident within Irish society more generally. Of particular importance here is, again, Richard Burke's thesis that the supposedly ancient northern conflict was largely a consequence of the way in which, ironically, both sides perceived their political salvation in the quintessentially modern, ubiquitously consensual, yet highly explosive idea of democracy. Consequently, it might be argued that Irish society, and particularly Northern Irish society, has exhibited a condition not wholly dissimilar, though with radically different symptoms, to that which, according to Harrison, has been typically displayed by our British neighbour, whereby, and I quote, centrist tendencies are strong despite our lack of overtly centrist structures. Neither have Irish historians been completely oblivious to the more overtly consensual dimensions of their island's otherwise turbulent history. For instance, Alvin Jackson has frequently highlighted the existence of centrist themes in what might be broadly defined as the centrist political tradition within modern Irish history. Particularly significant case in point here is FSL Lyon's pioneering scholarly explorations of the experiments in cultural fusion between the island's Anglo-Irish and Gaelic nationalist traditions, which occurred against the backdrop of the Parnellite parliamentary campaign for Home Rule. Suffice to say that Irish historians, such as Senior Paseta, have been intrigued by the vision of an emerging broad and political and cultural consensus on the island in the decades after the famine, one that might continue to evolve and flourish if it hadn't been for the 1916 rebels seizing Irish history and redirecting it. In this sense, then, Patrick Pearse is to this tentative post-famine rapprochement what, in a certain respects, equally zealous Margaret Thatcher was to Britain's post-war political consensus. Nevertheless, it's only natural that historians of Northern Ireland should think that political consensus is a sort of British preoccupation, and that their own preoccupation with the origins, course and consequences of the Troubles is equally justified. It's most certainly the case that, as John Regan has contended, the influence of the Troubles upon Irish historiography is far from wholly understood. It follows then that the conflict's influence upon British historical scholarship remains extremely unclear. That said, the development of the so-called terrorism industry within Irish academia since the 1970s makes for an intriguing juxtaposition when set against the simultaneous evolution of the British historian's fascination with the post-war political consensus. Arguably, these contrapuntal historiographical trends precipitate the conclusion, never mooted purely in the existing literature, that the escalation of conflict in Northern Ireland was actually a relatively significant factor in triggering the scholarly turn to political consensus on the other side of the Irish Sea. But although it is tempted to utilise the tragic history of Northern Ireland in order to subvert Harrison's peaceable kingdom thesis, his conviction that consensus has been very powerfully present in Britain since at least the Restoration, that would be predictable and futile. By focusing on conflict and thereby depicting consensus as somehow absent to Northern Ireland, you'd merely be perpetuating the status quo. A very different line of attack is necessitated here. It would seem that the most tactically effective way of contradicting Harrison's contention that consensus was never present in Northern Ireland is rather to fundamentally agree with him, to try and validate his belief that political consensus has been in fact more continually present outside the realm of the British post-war political consensus than it has been customary for people to assume. In one respect, this is actually quite easy to do. Since the brokering of the Belfast (Good Friday Agreement) in April 1998, it is clear that a species of consensus, to borrow a phrase from Paul Addison, has existed, if precariously, in the region, a consensus that has manifested itself structurally in the form of a devolved power-sharing executive at Stormont, composed of representatives of the Unionist, Nationalist and Unionist communities and others who don't fall into those communities, elected via an intricate mode of proportional representation in the form of the D'Hondt system, and boasting a mode of dual authority in the form of First and Deputy First Minsters. Indeed, the latter two features very much hark back to the Assembly's post-First World War Weimar precedent, another attempt at the British engineering political consensus elsewhere. Of course, it is worth highlighting here how the multi-party negotiations that precipitated the Good Friday Agreement operated under the principle of sufficient consensus. Moreover, historians, and if anyone saw Fitzpatrick's film last night, and John Hume will know this, historians are increasingly aware that the advent of political consensus in Northern Ireland in 1998 owed much to the evolution of a much broader, more formidable consensus on Ireland between the British, Irish and indeed US governments from the late 1970s onwards. Arguably then, it now feels constructive to think in terms of Northern Ireland's own post-war or post-Troubles political consensus. Given its complex origins and moreover the turbulent situation that it replaced, it might even be contended that Northern Ireland's post-war consensus is perhaps more significant and fascinating than its much-studied post-Second World War British precedent. Admittedly, as Jennifer Todd and indeed a host of commentators and scholars have highlighted, since its founding in 1998 and especially since 2012, political consensus in Northern Ireland has been uneasy and beset by a series of formidable crises. Nevertheless, much like the Union it maintains, this consensus has so far endured, displaying, again, like the Union, a capacity to adapt and evolve, if not always in the most effective or, in the eyes of many commentators, satisfying manner. The great and much lamented shift from the idyllic and predictable consensus between the moderate centre parties of the SDLP and the UUP to one bridging the extremes of Sinn Féin and the DUP is an intriguing case in point here. But what is particularly important is that the vision of Northern Ireland's post-agreement political landscape precipitates a key conclusion, which, to paraphrase Brian Harrison, if only for reasons of historical balance, it is perhaps now time to revive the earlier British preoccupation with consensus, albeit with a determinedly Northern Irish focus. That said, this process is already somewhat underway. Significantly, in marked contrast to the situation in 1996 when a Harrison's exploration of consensus was published, it's now scholars of Northern Ireland who are seeking to define and keen to understand the consensus that was established in 1998. Furthermore, it can be argued that the factors precipitating the scholarly turn to consensus in Northern Ireland are somewhat similar to those that generated the consensus paradigm within British historical scholarship. One of these was, of course, the release of governmental papers covering the war years. In the Northern Irish context, the origins and course of the so-called Troubles have been relatively well mapped, and it's consequently scholars are ever more interested in the evolution of the peace process and are eager to exploit the increasing availability of governmental papers relating to the very early stages of this process. It also almost goes without saying that, as this event shows, the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement has encouraged scholarly reflection upon the peace process and the curious mode of consensus politics that it precipitated. On the other hand, however, not to get too contemporary here, I am a historian, the political fallout of Brexit has again spotlighted the partition of Ireland, exposed and reaffirmed key divisions between Sinn Féin and the DUP, and, moreover, has seemingly fundamentally contradicted Hume's cherished and oft-celebrated vision of European integration as the key catalyst of Ireland's healing process. In addition, the anniversary of the agreement has come and passed while the NI executive remains suspended. It could well be then that just as the theory of a harmonious post-war political consensus in British politics is said to have emerged in response to the gulfs and divisions that perceived to exist during the Thatcherite era, viewed against the current political and economic malaises in Britain, Northern Ireland, the Republic, the EU, and indeed America, so April 1998 and the years surrounding it increasingly and understandably possesses now a special glow for scholars, commentators, and politicians. It's probably quite likely that, just as occurred in the British historiographical context, in the years ahead, we'll probably see a lot more studies evidencing the thesis, now very much in the air, that the vision of the agreement is a great consensual moment in Irish history, one ushering in an inspirational era of political consensus, is merely an illusion, and that the current consensus is rather simply the continuation of conflict by political means. Indeed, here one thinks of Roy Foster's conviction that the agreement did not so much produce political consensus in Northern Ireland, rather it institutionalised and basically normalised sectarian division. Just move on. What about the history of Northern Ireland more generally? Was consensus actually extinct before 1998? True, it's probably the case that Harrison's consensus was never present thesis can never be wholly refuted with regards to large swathes of Northern Ireland's troubled past. Yet if one was to explore even the darker recesses of Northern Ireland's history using a more experimental method, then perhaps consensus might be a little more easy to understand. And it's crucial here that both Paul Addison and Brian Harrison have highlighted that consensus is a relative term. And arguably no more is this theory of historical relativity more applicable and likely to precipitate intriguing results than in the case of Northern Ireland. For if it is accepted that, as Theodore Moody once quite rightly pointed out, Irish history is more than merely the history of conflict, and that consensus is indeed a relative term, then logically it must follow, and perhaps here it's useful to reference the criminological theory of a society of saints, i.e. in a society of saints you would still have crime, probably, most certainly. Whilst conflict may certainly be the overriding theme within Northern Ireland's history, nevertheless political consensus could never have been wholly extinct, only radically diminished. It's certainly the case that a far more far-fetched theory of relativity has been extant within British commentary in Northern Ireland, yielding that persistent and frustrating theme whereby, as Richard Burke has again demonstrated, the conflict tends to be depicted, even by scholars, in terms of tribalism, atavism, mysticism and the like. One recalls Edward Heath's contention that the tribal loathing he perceived in Northern Ireland sprang from an atavism which most of Europe discarded long ago. Likewise, again and again, not least Morris Fitzpatrick, scholars have depicted John Hume as an oasis of political modernity in the midst of an irrational, atavistic sectarian conflict. Moreover, Arthur Aughey and Ian McBride have highlighted how the notion of that Northern Ireland has remained in a sort of 17th century rut is a familiar but misleading notion. Curiously, however, the idea of Northern Ireland being somehow kind of chronologically out of sync with British political modernity is not actually that sci-fi, and in a way that should be relevant to scholars of political consensus. Importantly, historians of Northern Ireland are increasingly alert to the fact that, owing precisely to the fact that there was a conflict in Northern Ireland, the post-war Keynesian economic consensus survived in Northern Ireland long after it had been practically dismantled in Britain by Thatcher. Aviard highlighting, who's given his paper over there, how in Ulster, ironically, the public sector reached its apogee in the mid-1980s under the Thatcher governments. Of course, the quest here is for more kind of native manifestations of political consensus thus vindicating Harrison's thinking. Crucially, by wielding a concept developed by Harrison and one seemingly ruthlessly applied by Margaret Thatcher, that of the indirect route as opposed to the direct route to consensus, of basically braving short-term dissension to establish a new, more stable consensus in the future, of basically peace through war, or Pax Squared or Bellur, as was Oliver Cromwell's personal motto, one might be able to generate more nuanced understandings of the idea of political consensus in Northern Ireland. For example, it's worth highlighting here, as Alvin Jackson has observed, authors have typically emphasised the consensual elements in the careers of Ulster's peacemakers, such as Trimble, Adams, and more conventionally, John Hume. Yet in order to generate more complex understandings of the evolution of peace, arguably it's necessary to do the very opposite, particularly in the case of Hume and Trimble. I was intending to speak on both, but I think, given what you were treated to last night and time constraints, I'll just say a few words about Hume and then I'll finish up. Let's look at Hume. To begin with, there was the very early consensual and very optimistic experiment in something like Catholic loyalism during the mid-1960s, as evidenced by his much-studied The Northern Catholic pieces in the Irish Times, whereby the Northern state was to be worked by Northern nationalists in order to gain the trust and respect of Unionists, leading in the long term to political consensus in some form of an agreed Ireland. It is important to note here that Harrison and consensus historians seem to be very unaware of the very important fact that there was a consensual moment in Northern Ireland's history, one that witnessed, for example, the formation of a short-lived nationalist opposition at Stormont. Moreover, it is true that Hume's conviction was that the two communities would inevitably peacefully outgrow the partitioned entity of Northern Ireland owing to economic development, just as his own city of Derry had outgrown its walls in the second quarter of the 19th century, something he studied in detail in his MA thesis, Social and Economic Aspects of the Growth of Derry. That said, Hume's political career can also be read as a series of very belligerent attempts to channel visions of siege warfare. For example, his presidency of the Alternative Assembly in the autumn of 1971, accompanied by a rent and rate strike by nationalists, can be read as an attempt by Hume to starve the Unionist regime of political legitimacy and thus into submission. And this chimes with a broader perspective on Irish nationalist politics observed by Oliver McDonough, whereby from O'Connell to Parnell to Griffith to Hume, the aim of nationalist political leaders has been to mobilise and deploy political pressure in order to force the British to treat for terms with Irish nationalism. Indeed, if you're looking for a prime example of a politician who pursued consensus via the combative, Thatcherite indirect route, i.e. of braving short-term dissension to establish a new and more stable consensus in the future, then look no further than John Hume and indeed key aspects of his political campaign. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, for instance, as Hume said, the Protestant boil had to be lanced, and of course Hume Adams, which had a massive backlash. Furthermore, it was always Hume's conviction, one which is now an article of faith among his many zealous admirers, Maurice Fitzpatrick, that the unforgivable moral feeling of Wilson's Labour government in the spring of 1974 was that it didn't brave short-term dissension to pursue consensus. It didn't brave short-term dissension in the form of the UWC strike, and so the prospect of political consensus in Northern Ireland was lost for another 20 years. And very much supporting the idea that Hume has been in fact a key exponent of this belligerent indirect mode of seeking political consensus is David Trimble's enlightening statement to Frank Miller that John Hume never gets his head around the concept of consent. And what of my Lord Trimble's approach? Well, there's certainly a complex issue here, not least because Trimble's a very cerebral character, but all I will say is this, in this part, is that significant respects Trimble has been a very militant peacemaker, to the extent that it's actually very constructive to survey him in comparison to his Republican nemesis, Gerry Adams. Suffice to say that both men have also, in their own respective ways, been key practitioners of the indirect, combative route to consensus. So to round things up, it may just be that the mode of political consensus that currently exists in Northern Ireland is essentially the conflict pursued by other means. Yet we still do not know enough about the intricacies of this consensus to come up with any firm conclusions, which is precisely why an earlier preoccupation with political consensus now needs to be resurrected, if only in anticipation of the release of the relevant documentary material. Yet a very strong case can be made that Northern Ireland's current post-war political consensus was constructed via political and seemingly consensual ideologies and strategies that were in fact far more combative and militant, i.e. indirect, than scholars and commentators have hitherto countenanced. Indeed, it might also be suggested that it's not so much that consensus has never been present in Northern Ireland. It is the case, rather, that in order to track and understand the way in which political consensus has existed in Northern Ireland, historians need to approach the issue via more conceptually driven perspectives, precisely the type of perspectives which, as Enda Delaney has highlighted, are sorely lacking within modern Irish historiography. But what is certainly clear is the fact that the history of post-agreement in Northern Ireland, if not the history of Ulster more generally, demands incorporation into the idea of the post-war consensus and the consensus view and paradigm. And although understandable, the prevailing historiographical partition between consensus in Britain and consensus in Northern Ireland is pretty unnecessary, unnatural, and rather unjustified. So in many ways, our paper started out with a sort of unionist agenda and has kind of talked itself into a kind of almost mode of historical republicanism. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Liz de Young. Liz de Young is with her talk, War by Other Means, Power, Politics and Planning in Post-Agreement Belfast. Liz de Young is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Irish Studies, University of Liverpool. She holds a master's with distinction from the Institute of Irish Studies, King University Belfast, and a BA in International Affairs and Modern Languages from Northeastern University, Boston. She is politics editor for the Liverpool Postgraduate Journal of Irish Studies and on the steering committee for the Women on Ireland Research Network and the University of Liverpool Athena Swan Programme. You good? Yes. Awesome. All right.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction. This is kind of a nice follow-up from your paper. So as many of us know, we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I've changed the title as well. We've also recently passed the first anniversary of the Northern Ireland Assembly's collapse in January 2017. And over a year later, the two main political parties, the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin, are still at a seemingly intractable stalemate. So what happened? How did we get from the aspirational rhetoric of the agreement, which promised a new future for Northern Ireland, to the current dysfunctional political situation? This paper will explore some of the dynamics of the post-agreement assembly, which have brought us to the current impasse. I want to argue that essentially these dynamics suggest the failure of consociationalism, or power sharing, to deliver either the promises of the agreement or the rule of law enshrined in the subsequent Northern Ireland Act. So I'm going to use the case study of the Girdwood Army Barracks in North Belfast, which you can see here before it was, when it was demilitarized, to kind of frame some of these concepts. This regeneration project was a test case for putting the rhetoric of the agreement into practice, promoting equality, democracy, mutual trust between parties, and a peace dividend for those areas that saw the worst of the Troubles. Girdwood was formerly one of the major army barracks in Troubles era Belfast, and it was demilitarized as part of the peace process. So this was 27 acres to develop in one of the most deprived and divided areas of Northern Ireland. As you can see here, just across the way is one of the famous peace lines. So it was asserted that if there's anywhere in Northern Ireland that can physically symbolize our transition to a new society, it will be a shared, welcoming, and open space at Girdwood. But this transition has not occurred. In fact, old patterns of conflict are now expressed through politics and planning, so that sectarianism, territorialism, and zero-sum resource competition shape decision-making. Politics has become, as Foucault deftly puts it, the continuation of war by other means, and this is reflected in the Girdwood case. So I've used these idioms, white elephant and red herring, to kind of conceptualize the Girdwood development and also how it speaks to wider political dynamics in Northern Ireland. Red herring, a seemingly plausible, though ultimately irrelevant diversionary tactic, something that distracts from the issue at hand. In terms of Girdwood, elements of unionism in the form of namely the DUP use the rhetoric of good relations and shared space to block the provision of social housing on the site, in contrast to the provisions of the agreement and the Northern Ireland Act. And then we have a white elephant, a possession which its owner cannot dispose of, whose cost is out of proportion to its usefulness, an expensive, useless building. So the Girdwood development fell victim to these red herrings, with the result it's now an £11.7 million state-of-the-art community hub that has fundamentally failed to transform the area, put the promises of the agreement into practice, or tackle the root causes of division and enmity, a white elephant. And I think this echoes what's kind of happened with the devolved government. The consociational framework meant to transform society has in practice only managed the conflict, bringing it into the corridors of power. Instead of working towards a shared future, towards equality and respect, as official rhetoric had promised, informal politics tend towards this us versus them mentality, a shared out zero-sum game between two ethno-sectarian blocs. And this only reinforces rather than challenges division. So I want to do three things today. I'm going to briefly highlight some key tenets of the agreement, which were enshrined into law by the Northern Ireland Act. I'm going to use the Girdwood Barracks redevelopment to show how this post-agreement power-sharing government failed to deliver on this framework. And finally, I'm going to assert that the eventual product of the redevelopment, the Girdwood Community Hub, is a white elephant, a physical expression or microcosm of the flawed political dynamics which produced it, which we see today have eventually run out of road. So just a quick background on the agreement. I've just put up a couple of blurbs for you here. It officially brought an end to the Troubles, and it envisioned a new Northern Ireland, a shift from a sectarianized, discriminatory system to one based on democratic principles and human rights. That political decision-making and resource allocation would not be influenced by identity politics or ethnic division, but on tackling inequality and targeting resources to the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. In turn, this would create a peace dividend for those deprived and divided areas most affected by the Troubles. So it was meant to be transformative. To deliver these aspirations, as Tommy pointed out, a power-sharing government was put into place, with the idea that both groups would play an equal part in decision-making. There wouldn't be a majority-minority dynamic, kind of leveling the playing field. So it seemed that better times were ahead. And this is Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, which was meant to be at the cornerstone of all subsequent policy-making and planning. It sets out the statutory duty of government to promote equality of opportunity, irrespective of ethnicity or religious background. And I'll just leave that for you to read, because it should be a critical part of the legislative framework of Northern Ireland, at the very heart of policy-making. So it's important to note here that equality comes before good relations, ensuring that resources are targeted to those who most need them, regardless of background. But in practice, post-agreement political planning has taken a different turn. The more moderate UUP and SDLP who brokered the agreement have been replaced as actors of power by the DUP and Sinn Féin. Under these more kind of ethnically intransigent and extreme parties, we have two kind of polarized blocs in power with competing agendas. And as a result, power sharing has become an effective proxy war, played out in competition for resources and territory. The rule of law or democratic principles are only used to the extent they don't harm the interests of the ethnic groups in power. And we see this in the way space is used, perceived, and developed. The case of the former Girdwood Barracks is a perfect example. Competition over resources and territory between the DUP and Sinn Féin fundamentally shaped and perverted the regeneration process. So at this point, I'd just like to introduce a little background on the geography of the site itself. Sorry, this is just a slide kind of highlighting some key literature that kind of backs up this idea of the proxy war and the idea that, planning and policymaking are now used to manipulate spatial relations rather than deliver social justice. So I'll just kind of skip by that. So Girdwood is located in lower North Belfast. It was the main army barracks during the Troubles, and this area was disproportionately affected by violence during the conflict, experienced a huge amount of trauma, and this is reflected in high levels of ethnic segregation. I like how the poet Kieran Carson puts it, existing in frictions and factions, and you can see here, this is a map of the site. Girdwood sits between four highly segregated areas. The yellow, you have the Nationalist Catholic Lower Cliftonville and New Lodge, and the Protestant Unionist Lower Shankill and Lower Old Park. And you can see how Girdwood kind of functions as a buffer zone. And these areas are not only divided, but they're economically and socially deprived. You have among the highest levels of poverty, unemployment, poor mental and physical health in Northern Ireland and the UK. So initially, the demilitarization of the site in the wake of the agreement offered a massive opportunity. And this is a way to put rhetoric and legislation into practice, target inequality, and bring the peace dividend to North Belfast. And the transformation was symbolic, in a city emerging from conflict. So there were initially these grand plans for the site. It was seen as being of international significance, a social and economic catalyst for the area. You can see here, it was envisioned as this whole new quarter for the city, having a peace building, citizenship center. At one point, Prony, the public records office, was a possibility. You can kind of see these green spaces and new routes and routines. And in line with housing need at the time, the housing executive had suggested a major social housing element. This was backed up by Section 75, the equal targeting of resources according to objective need. North Belfast suffers a documented and serious housing crisis, overwhelmingly in nationalist areas. And it's because of the demographic shift over the past few decades. The Protestant demographic of North Belfast and Belfast in general has been declining and aging due to a combination of redevelopment, conflict, and intra-communal feuding. At the same time, the Catholic population is younger, more demographically robust. So what you have is essentially, traditionally Protestant areas have physically declined. You can see they're prone to vacancy, dereliction, and whilst Catholic areas are bursting at the seams. This is a nationalist area. You can see the houses are built right up to the peace line. And this means you have families waiting for years for a house, stuck in temporary accommodation, hostels, homeless, living in poor conditions. And this is kind of another dramatic example, and this is the New Lodge, just on the one side of Girdwood. You can see it's really thickly settled and built up. On the other side of Girdwood, you have the Lower Old Park, which is marked by vacant space. And here I'd just like to put up a couple of statistics from the time of the Girdwood redevelopment process, so you can see there's serious housing need. But this demographic shift and housing crisis plays on a narrative of cultural dissipation, loss, and betrayal among elements of the Protestant Unionist working class, particularly in the post-agreement period. The equality agenda in Section 75 was seen to represent a symbolic loss, as it's perceived as being inherently biased towards Catholics and thereby opposed to the interests of Protestants. The zero-sum reading is kind of typical of Northern Ireland. A gain for one group becomes a loss for the other. There's a sense for some Protestant Unionists that Catholics are gaining ground, both physically and symbolically, and thus that losing territory is akin to cultural dissolution. This is particularly acute in highly segregated places like North Belfast. And as the largest unionist party, the DUP couldn't be perceived as literally or figuratively giving ground to nationalist Catholics. They needed to respond to this narrative of loss, and they also needed to maintain the electoral balance of the area. The DUP holds a very slim lead in the constituency of North Belfast, and more nationalist residents potentially meant more nationalist votes, thus threatening their power. So here's where the red herrings come in. We have two main discursive tactics that were deployed by the DUP as a diversion from Section 75 and to block the provision of social housing. So this was done to ensure a continued electoral majority and symbolic control over territory. So the first red herring to supersede Section 75 is that of good relations and shared space. So the first phase of the development, around 2006, the DUP insisted that Gird would be a shared space with mixed use and community facilities to encourage economic development. It was argued that any Catholic housing would preclude unionist access to the space, so it would not be shared, and thus good relations would not be possible. You can see here examples of some of the rhetoric around the site at that time. You have a nationalist representative, the DUP, and a UDA member. If you just want to kind of give that a read. Basically, see, the DUP's argument for shared space and economic development is kind of a convenient deflection from the underlying sense of territoriality and perceived encroachment on traditional Protestant lands suggested by the UDA members' response. And this, by accepting this, it's kind of a latent legitimization of the sense of territoriality and encroachment within elements of Protestant unionism. And that this symbolic sense of fear and threat is a valid excuse to not build housing for people who are homeless and temporary accommodation, etc. A report issued by the Equality Coalition described this as a problematic trend in policymaking, whereby policies are assessed for their adverse impacts on good relations because they're politically contentious. And this undermines that rhetoric of equality and mutual trust set forth in the agreement and the Act. Section 75 specifically notes that equality must come before good relations. You can see here some responses to the DUP's use of good relations as a discursive tactic, which kind of highlight why it's so problematic, that lack of consensus essentially constitutes a veto. And if we were to do this with racial or gender equality, it would be unthinkable. But as actors of power in government, the DUP succeeded in framing this debate to the exclusion of social housing. No pun intended, but no accommodation could be reached on the issue, and eventually the lack of consensus resulted in stalemate. The project was abandoned. So if you fast forward to 2009, the site lay derelict in the midst of an economic crash, and it was at this time there were no other options to develop it, no investment coming in. City Council applied to the EU Peace 3 program to secure funding for the site. The idea was to create a shared space. And this meant a community hub, leisure, educational facilities, and notably, again, some measure of social housing in line with the waiting list was part of the official bid. But again, unionist discursive tactics subverted the eventual outcome, and this time the term differential deprivation was used. And what this meant was that unionists framed overcrowding and homelessness on the nationalist side as congruent with dereliction and vacancy on the unionist side. According to this differential, providing new build homes in nationalist Catholic areas had to be matched by investment in derelict and blighted Protestant areas so that people would then move back to them. And this is a problematic way to view housing, as activist group PPR points out. The core function of social housing is to tackle objective need. So the red herring of differential deprivation diverts attention from the disproportionate amount of nationalists in housing stress and kind of, transfers resources from areas of high demand to areas of low demand. And this was reflected in the final master plan for the site, as you can see here. There was kind of a scramble to frame the deal before the time ran out, and essentially what we have is a shared out compromise between the DUP and Sinn Féin. You have the leisure centre in yellow in the middle, playing field and indoor sports centre, and then you have two separate areas of housing, one on the nationalist side of the development and one on the unionist side of the development, and each would get 60 houses. And what this speaks to and physically demonstrates is the dynamics of government. You have a shared out rather than a shared future. The master plan is a microcosm of the power-sharing government in the post-agreement period. You have the zero-sum competition for resources and space and legitimacy. So equality means, instead of, okay, we have 2,500 people on the waiting list, let's build houses and tackle it, equality becomes horizontal, tit for tat, one for you, one for me, each side gets their equal share. Resources are divvied up by ethnicity and political expediency as opposed to democratically. On a broader level, this dynamic's been described as a deal process rather than a peace process. Contrary to the rhetoric of the agreement, these deals and side deals only constitute a model of peace without reconciliation. As Dolan puts it, a culture of endless negotiation has become embedded, and without a vision of a shared society to sustain it, the peace process has lost the power to inspire. Now, the result is that £11.7 million of peace-building money was squandered on a state-of-the-art white elephant. It's a beautiful building, but it's essentially a leisure center. And the result is 60 houses total in an area where 938 are needed at the minute. The state did not adhere to their statutory legislation to provide housing. Continued inequality, social exclusion, and serious deprivation persist in the surrounding neighborhoods. It could have been an internationally significant development. It could have had a tangible and measurable impact on those very real social issues that North Belfast faces, the so-called peace dividend. It could have made a difference to a society emerging from conflict, but rather, I argue that the Girdwood Hub has only inscribed and reproduced the status quo in space, failing to tackle the underlying structures of segregation and sectarianism which still pervade society. And if you replaced Girdwood with the words the agreement or the act, I argue it would be the same concept. There's all this opportunity and aspiration that's been lost in ethno-sectarian wrangling. So Girdwood and the dynamics of decision-making it represents, this kind of, negotiation and compromise, contributed to the eventual collapse of this system of governance. We can see in the 2016 Assembly elections, Sinn Féin's voters, there was some grassroots frustration and anger over the lack of social housing and over Sinn Féin's continued willingness to kind of compromise with the DUP. So we saw their share of total votes fall, new actors like People Before Profit emerging in traditionally Sinn Féin constituencies. The tipping point for the Assembly's eventual failure was ostensibly the Renewable Heat Initiative, or RHI scandal, where there were allegations of corruption, certainly inefficiency, and massive public anger. So Sinn Féin could no longer be seen to compromise as they did on the social housing element of Girdwood. So they collapsed the Assembly in 2017. Over a year later, Northern Ireland is still without a government, and countless rounds of talks between the DUP and Sinn Féin have failed. It's no longer in Sinn Féin's interest to keep the institutions afloat, particularly with grassroots pressure around an Irish Language Act, the DUP's obstinacy on issues like equal marriage, minority language rights. So stalemate and stasis have now replaced the previous dynamic of trade-off and reluctant compromise that built Girdwood. This is now the symbolic benchmark of the zero-sum game, and it suggests the ultimate failure of power sharing. We see the dynamics that shaped Girdwood have now run out of road. We see a failed political system mired in deadlock. And this test case shows that a political appetite for genuine conflict transformation, equality, inclusive citizenship, social justice, all this kind of aspirational rhetoric which we saw in the agreement is lacking in practice. These considerations are ignored in favor of a zero-sum system where common benefit and vision is frustrated by ethno-sectarian tension and territoriality, where conflict between two groups is still acted out, albeit in the arena of policymaking and planning. You have this internationally significant shared space and a key opportunity for housing provision and social justice become a parochial form of shared out resource competition, a tit-for-tat equation which essentially benefits no one. Again, a white elephant. So in the end, as Haas noted after a previous failed round of talks, quote, Northern Ireland cannot be held up as a model of conflict resolution. The moral basis of the 98 Accord has evaporated, which is why 20 years on, Northern Ireland remains a fundamentally divided and disagreed place. Thank you. Wish I could end it on a more cheerful note.
Very much. And our final speaker is Dr. Martin Chung, with his talk, The Politics of Antagonism Revisited, Assessing the Good Friday Agreement, 1998 to 2018, within the framework of political reconciliation. Dr. Martin Chung holds a PhD from the University of Hong Kong. Previously, he was Research Assistant Professor of the European Union Academic Programme, Hong Kong. His major publications include Repentance for the Holocaust, Lessons from Jewish Thought for Confronting the German Past, published by Cornell University Press in 2017, and Reconciling with the Past, Resources and Obstacles in a Global Perspective, published by Routledge 2017, co-edited with Annika Freeberg. Among other subjects, he teaches British politics at Hong Kong Baptist University. Over to you, Dr. Chung.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the wonderful introduction, which we wrote ourselves, right? So. Okay. Now, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this platform and accepting my proposal. It's a great place to be. And I have to begin by apologizing for not having actually a full research paper to present, but rather some preliminary notes to share with you, because I just finished a week-long research stay at Queen's University, Belfast, and I'm still at the stage of organizing and processing the materials I've gathered there. So I have some thoughts, some reflections that I would like to hear your opinion on this project that I just started earlier this year. It is a completely new venture for me, going from post-1945 Germany, its difficulty of what they call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, moving to the situation in Northern Ireland. So I'll be presenting some preliminary remarks on the research project and some of the research direction that I plan to pursue to analyze the Good Friday Agreement, its implementation, and the wider peace process, which I think is extremely valuable, despite all the deficiencies and imperfections. Valuable in a comparative perspective, and deserves a book-length treatment. So I'll begin my presentation this afternoon with a few background notes, why my interest in this topic, because I understand it's not exactly self-explanatory that why somebody from Hong Kong would be interested in Northern Ireland, except that in 2015 there was this a very amusing news about this newly archived records show that there was a bizarre proposal by a Northern Ireland official to move millions of Hong Kong citizens to the region during the Troubles to offer a new political future to both populations. And of late, of course, for those following Brexit, or especially about the border issue here, the so-called Hong Kong solution has also been offered by some as a possible solution for the border after Brexit. But then, of course, it basically means a hard border between the SAR, Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China. So it's certainly a solution that would be favored by those who would like to see the eventual reunification of Ireland North and South. Because it would basically mean cutting Northern Ireland from Great Britain. My interest, however, comes from the other side of the comparative angle, and that has to do with the present political situation in the city. Having witnessed the umbrella movement in Hong Kong in late 2014, through which Hong Kong citizens, especially but not only the youth, said no to Beijing's ersatz universal suffrage proposal and the subsequent sporadic violent encounters between various groups in the city, I'm increasingly aware of the emergence of a new politics of antagonism in the city. Not only has, for example, language become another political battlefield, so Cantonese versus Mandarin or simplified versus traditional Chinese. Same for playing the national anthem in schools and universities. And also something like oath-taking in the SAR's Legislative Council has become a tool to exclude directly elected parliamentarians labeled as pro-independence and therefore unconstitutional. And also policing was for a time difficult due to its being perceived as biased towards pro-establishment camps. So there are certain, when you experience those, and in reading what happened in Northern Ireland during and before the troubles and after the trouble, you see a certain, what was going on. It's just like a kind of deja vu. However, having said that, Hong Kong's troubles still dwarf in comparison to Northern Ireland's, thankfully. And there's no comparable religious ethnic cleavage hardened by centuries of injustice and mutual myth-making, to speak of, in the Han Chinese dominant city. Although a question that we sometimes ask behind somebody's back is, is he a yellow ribbon or blue ribbon, meaning a pro-independence or pro-establishment kind of guy? And I think that kind of division is becoming more and more entrenched. However, the increasing anti-system polarization, and the emergent proclivity towards confrontation, not only between yellows and blues, but also between if I may borrow these terms from the history of Northern Ireland, constitutional nationalists and Republicans among Hong Kong Democrats, meaning those who think the further democratization in Hong Kong can be achieved within the People's Republic of China, and those who believe that you have to break away from this in order to achieve full democratization. And also there's increased racism, which can be felt in the city, especially against those Mandarin-speaking migrants and visitors. And even violence claimed to be justified on both sides, and all this seemed to be far from the politics of accommodation described by Aaron Leipart, and with which, as we know, O'Leary and McGarry measured the case of Northern Ireland in the early 1990s. Hence the endeavor to study Northern Ireland from this perspective, to try to look at it as some kind of model. Once again, imperfect, but it seems that at least when it comes to peace, stopping the violence and have a 20 period of precarious cooperation seems to be some kind of model of transforming basically antagonism to accommodation, while at the same time I also endeavor to try to probe whether 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, the two concepts of antagonism and accommodation are still relevant for the assessment of the region and helping it move forward. And if not, if antagonism and accommodation are no longer applicable, what are some of the viable alternative conceptual frameworks? So my main research questions, first of all, I need to deal with these conceptual questions in order, and then later on can help me collect and also analyze the empirical data. So what kind of model is post-agreement Northern Ireland, and to what extent has antagonism been transformed into accommodation? Not only in terms of, in the formal sense of moving from hegemonic control to power sharing. What kind of empirical evidence can be furnished to describe the ongoing albeit at times relapsing transformation of Northern Ireland into perhaps one may say a post-Reformation, post-colonial and post-national society, something that is perhaps a bit more like the European Union, which Europeanists like Habermas, like Elizabeth Büttner, fondly speak of, and from which not few Northern Ireland peacemakers have drawn inspiration, like Hume himself, for example. Although, of course, lest we forget, Northern Ireland won the Nobel Peace Prize through Hume and Trimble 14 years earlier than the European Union. Now, with the present research project, the aim is to make a contribution to the ongoing debate about the exemplarity of the case of Northern Ireland by focusing on the change of fundamental attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and structures, constituting the institutional change as embodied by the GFA and its implementation. In answering whether Northern Ireland is actually a model or not, James Hughes characterizes the case as a reconstruction without reconciliation. And earlier on we heard Liz, I think she mentioned, this is peace without reconciliation again. I think there's a general sentiment there. He reiterates the criticism expressed by many that consociationalism is primarily about institutional design, with little to deliver when it comes to intercommunal reconciliation or the healing of collective relationships wounded by past wrongdoings. In particular, he singles out residential segregation, again, that's the topic of this paper, which he calls a product of colonial authoritarian social engineering, alongside parallel education as among the aspects of post-agreement Northern Ireland where there's little to boast about. This is also the sentiment I got when I interviewed Anna Lowe, a former member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland from the Alliance Party, who was born in Hong Kong, so there's Dolan, who airs similar, off-cited objection that the GFA actually insensitivizes polarization rather than discourages it. So this is one part of, I think, one major question I want to find out. How, in what ways is the agreement actually promoting or insensitivizing, like she asserts, rather than discourages polarization. In the parlance of consociation theorists, the centripetal power sharing of the past, meaning Sunningdale, is inferior to GFA's inclusive mechanism, which benefited hardliners on both sides initially and has worked towards their moderation eventually by providing them with the convenient alibi of mandatory coalition through the Dehorn method. The overwhelming academic focus on consociationalism, whether for or against it, I think, when it comes to the case of Northern Ireland, easily gives one the impression from the outside, like me, that this is what the Northern Ireland model is all about. In other words, if South Africa has given the world the model of truth and reconciliation, though it didn't pioneer it, of course, but popularized it globally, which stresses the role of the Christian idea of forgiveness in overcoming colonial and interracial division, Northern Ireland, in this reading, has shown other conflict regions how consociationalism works and doesn't, or how secular political science, plus the emphasis on economic development over religious issues, can cure sick political theologies. Now, this overarching focus on the intricacies of institutional design, however, overlooks societal attempts to achieve more than just a stable or political stability, on which the whole theoretical debate on consociational democracy within comparative politics is based. The fact is, the relative stability of different democratic systems has dominated comparative politics, from Gabriel Almond to Aaron Leipart to O'Leary and McGarry. The argument has gone full circle. So for Almond, the Anglo-American model, which is two-party majoritarianism, is superior in delivering stable democracies with this homogeneous secular political culture. Secular here meaning multi-value, rational, calculating, bargaining, and experimental. Leipart contends, however, that the multi-party system in the Benelux, Austria, Switzerland, consociational systems in short, can also deliver on stability. And with O'Leary and McGarry, the Northern Ireland problem laid bare the instability of the Anglo-American model in deeply divided societies. Instead, power-sharing consociation democracy, especially its centrifugal variant, offers a relatively better solution. In defining the politics of antagonism, McGarry and O'Leary saw it as the opposite of the politics of accommodation. That is, a stable democratic political order. The key word here is, of course, stable. For before the contemporary troubles, Northern Ireland was arguably democratic in a formal sense, but was characterized by hegemonic control, due in a small part to the shift in 1929 from the proportional representation to first past the post electoral system, which viewed political instability with its built-in injustice towards the permanent minority, with cleavage frozen by religious, ethnic, ideological identities. The civil rights movements came as a response to that injustice, and when coupled with the official intransigence, it heralded a period of instability which created, along the way, new injustices and atrocities of its own. Stability was brought back in the 1990s with an improved version of consociational democracy. Now, in this fable of political scientists, including the advanced debates on the functioning of the present power-sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland, individual and communal attempts at reconciliation matter very little to political stability, if at all. While intriguing and rewarding in its own right, there appears to be a fundamental problem with anchoring the Northern Ireland conflict and conflict resolution with the Good Friday Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement in consociational theory. As Rupert Taylor puts it, it is tantamount to reading the Northern Ireland problem through consociational lens and then trying to find a solution from that reading. The problem is that given the theory's preoccupation with institutional arrangements, the conflict parties, the communities and the individuals in the conflict and their respective aspirations and longings appear somewhat sidelined in the analysis, if not considered irrelevant altogether. Though most probably not by intention, in the extreme forms of institutionalist or neo-institutionalist thinking, individual actors appear as mere atoms in a well-designed machine which more or less efficiently channels their energies from uncontrolled explosion, which would mean conflict, to useful combustion, which would mean cooperation. Whether there is reconciliation or not, or whether political trust or new bonds can be built or rebuilt between and among the atoms, intra-communal and intercommunal, is not a primary concern. Yet the seminal works of peace and reconciliation studies, like John Polledera, have demonstrated that it is clearly a mistake for communities torn by past and present conflicts to pursue a kind of conflict resolution that prioritizes peace over justice, mercy, and truth, if the long-term welfare of the wounded collective relationship is the goal. From the viewpoint of research design, therefore, I think it is quite questionable to try to look at the entire peace process and the subsequent implementation of GFA within consociational lens. In the words of Gladys Ganiel and Paul Dixon, in a world in which the impact of religions is persistent, engaging with the religious dimension is a vital part of a broader-based strategy for dealing with the conflict in Northern Ireland, end of quote. My own research on the German-Jewish relationship also has shown that theologically charged concepts like repentance and reconciliation can serve as invaluable resources for overcoming otherwise insurmountable obstacles to interpersonal and intercommunal healing. It is therefore a working assumption of my project that one has to take the philosophical and theological assumptions of the conflict parties seriously in order to understand the challenges and obstacles to reconciliation from within. In other words, religious traditions and communities may also have what it takes to cure their sick political theologies, which can work side by side consociationalism's stabilizing effects. So basically, what I was trying to do, because I have only very little time left, what I was trying to do so far at this stage is to collect materials like this one, which is a discussion paper published in 1993 by a working party, which is a product of the Irish Interchurch meeting. And so there's this different groupings try to come together and find a way moving forward from sectarianism, which in this document it's looked at as something that is opposite of reconciliation, and making recommendations. So I think these internally generated materials are useful for outsiders like me to try to derive a framework for looking at, where is Northern Ireland now, 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, instead of trying to come up with some kind of clever scheme from political science and try to impose onto the situation. So I'm still in the process of digesting this kind of materials and to make a usable framework. Yes, they have some core ideas about reconciliation, which I think are useful for me to compare different cases of reconciliation, whether it's the post-German case or the post-agreement situation in Northern Ireland. And this understanding, I think, highlights several important elements. One is about truth recovery as the basis of common understanding of the past. Secondly, about confession, the importance of confession, reparation and remembrance on the part of the perpetrators and their communities. There's also a role for the victims and survivors, including the acceptance, very interestingly, the acceptance of a common burden of past wrongdoings. And finally, a forward or future-oriented vision and the agreement to move forward. So I'm still in the process of trying to draw out something that is useful for my analysis for the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and trying to make use of some of these indigenous or locally available intellectual resources that I could find there. So I would say, to conclude, it is always a challenge but rewarding to do comparative politics for, in the words of Adrian Guelker, whom I also met last week in Belfast, imitation is difficult to get to grips with analytically. Once you try to look at the differences, whether it's Hong Kong or Northern Ireland or post-war Germany, of course they are all different. But there's importance in political discourse when you try to compare. So Guelker highlighted several reasons for comparison. One, the legitimization of new arrangements necessary for healing. Two, offering a credible and visible framework for change. What to change and why make the change. Third, the reassurance of possible success, because it's very easy with our comparative case to say, making all these changes is not going to be useful because the other side is not going to change. And finally, it is also useful to do comparison to provide external standard, especially when one needs external support for the peace process. While the consociational approach has demonstrably served the region well in institutionalizing a political settlement of accommodation to bring about much needed peace after the last 30 years war in Christian Europe. In the post-agreement era, however, reconciliation calls for a broader and less elitist, a more bottom-up approach, which is favored by Hughes, to cement the hard-won peace and perhaps ultimately to make Northern Ireland alongside South Africa and post-war Germany as a viable model of post-war or post-conflict reconciliation for others to draw positive lessons from. So, thank you.
Okay, and now we'll have 30 minutes for questions. Could I invite the speakers to all sit up front? I think it makes most sense if you're all there and visible. We've been a chance for everyone to sit down, and then yes, I think well, we'll see how many questions there are first, and then we'll see how we so
question primarily for the others would like to discuss. I think it touches all the papers, but spent a time highlighting how there was an era after the Good Friday Agreement where each side learned to make deals with each other, and that eventually led to an impasse or sort of a change in the logic of politics that's happened very recently. Why did that change occur?
I think if you kind of look at the trajectory of the post-agreement period, there was always kind of this dynamic of Sinn Féin would kind of compromise to the DUP in the name of the greater good type thing. So, you know, you see kind of compromises on equal marriage or, you know, implementing welfare reform. And I think eventually, and particularly social housing was a huge issue as well, not just on the Girdwood site, but in the wider North Belfast. And I can only really speak for Belfast on that. I don't have information on the rest of social housing in Northern Ireland. But anyway, so there were all these kind of issues happening, and so grassroots frustration began to kind of simmer. You know, Sinn Féin's not delivering for us. We're not seeing the promises that they keep, you know, they keep talking about equality in Section 75, but they're not adhering to it. So I think eventually there was just a shift in the electorate to a breaking point where Sinn Féin kind of realized we're starting to lose votes. We need to change our tactics. And then with the whole, you know, RHI scandal and this public outcry over how the Assembly was functioning, I think Sinn Féin saw this as their opportunity to collapse the Assembly and go back to those principles of equality and, you know, charge the DUP with saying, well, you haven't held up to the agreement, so then they would kind of gain back that electoral clout that they lost. So I don't think it's relevant for Sinn Féin now to resurrect the institutions. They're kind of winning in the proxy game here. So that's my opinion anyway. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
In kind of one follow-up on it, there does seem to be a sense of time. You spoke about how in the immediate aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement, the parties had sort of an aspirational sense of the future. They were eager or looking to the future. It seems to me you're suggesting that they broke because they wanted to return to the past. A way of seeing the zero-sum logic of politics, a way of thinking about that it's now in our, and I understand you're saying it's their short-term political interest will get more votes in that election by doing this. But I don't know, it seems to me that it's a very interesting hypothesis that sort of there's a significant change in political calculations, at least of Sinn Féin. To some extent, the other parties, I mean, maybe your paper that tried to do the Ulster Union, but that might talk about this. Arlene Foster more interested in a shared future as much as Peter Robinson was, or is she more interested in holding on to a past where unionists could kind of have power and not have to share it? I'm just curious. The sense of time change, like, are we in a sea change of time, how the parties conceive of their role in each other?
Is that for me, or I can
No, I
tell?
think anybody. I thought that your paper sort of a consensus. Is there a consensus? Can there be a consensus? Are we out of a consensus?
Well, I mean, it's a funny one, like, more of listening to those papers, you say the consensus in Northern Ireland is that nobody wants to share power. I mean, it might not be that, like, but it is a consensus. The consensus is the institutions don't work. I mean, Sinn Féin don't want to resurrect them, the DUP don't want to work them. So in many ways, it's one of those kind of odd things that you think of consensus as always a positive idea, but there's actually quite negative aspects to the consensus in Northern Ireland, i.e. one, they don't want to run Partition. Two, there's an unwritten consensus with a lot of people between Sinn Féin and the DUP on things like gay rights and you know what I mean, like in marriage, that, you know, that they actually have, there's actually more that unites them on some of these more like sort of fronts that are actually quite controversial than people would like to let on, you know. But I think one of the things, the reason for the change in it, when the Good Friday Agreement happened, I mean, there was always that idea of that Blair government of keeping that buzz, keeping it as a kind of like bringing the big tent to Northern Ireland, you know, getting Elton John over there, you know, Bono was wheeled out all the time, you know what I mean, like, couldn't turn on your TV, you can't even turn on that Maurice Fitzpatrick is on there as well at Bono, do you know what I mean, like, that kind of keeping the momentum of the agreement going despite the fact, and once that kind of petered out, I mean, like, we're in very different times here, you know, the economy hasn't helped, people have sort of realised that peace wasn't that exciting. You know what I mean? The sheen kind of wore off it whenever the grim reality of, well, this institution has to just be worked now. You couldn't keep that buzz, that initial enthusiasm. And when you actually look back on the Sunningdale sort of fiasco. You see the Wilson government doing the same thing. It's like, oh, we need to keep the spirit of Sunningdale alive. If we can just keep the gimmick going and that it's a new era, and it's hard to maintain that. And you get that sea change about the mid-2000s where people start to be like, well, this isn't as kind of utopic as we all thought it was going to be. Like, it's not a new Northern Ireland. And the old sort of kind of animosities have come back. I don't think it's more of that, what you're saying, of people wanting to return to the past. But one thing I would say is that the people who brokered the agreement, the big guns like Hume and Paisley, were coming to the end of their careers and wanted that big out. Do you know what I mean? That one big kind of finale to their careers. Like Paisley was certainly like that. And now you've got a new generation coming through who that big reconciliation moment isn't part of their kind of like political memoir writing. It's, we have to work this, and we have people on the street saying we need to do this. So I think that's part of it as well.
Okay, take this now.
Yeah, just to respond to what you were saying there, something about consensus not always necessarily being a positive thing. That's something that I'm kind of really interested in, because I think there's a distinction perhaps between politics as a career and those big gestures and wanting consensus so as to have a certain status quo, and the economic backdrop to that, of course. That was the shine that was sold, I think, in 1998. But then there's also politics, as in polis, as in this people and what they want. So this resonates with what you were saying, Liz, about grassroots. Grassroots are just the people who vote for parties. So parties, when they're not doing what people have voted for them to do, then that's when power sharing has to stop at that point. And so I'm wondering if what's not interesting in the North is that idea that if it's not more interesting when there isn't consensus, really, and if that's not what we should always be fighting for, is not consensus, because when we have consensus, it means everybody has their part to play, and the status quo is assured, and real, not dissidence in a violent sense, obviously, but dissidence in terms of what we might want from our societies disappears at that point. So, if there isn't a way of looking at dissensus as a more positive thing to consider than consensus, this is all based on my readings of Jacques Rancière.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting theory you're proposing there, that actually, in many ways, the conflict, some ways, kind of brought out some of the better features of Northern Ireland society, because against the backlog of conflict, you had those great philosophies, like the Hume philosophy. It's like, we could build a better Northern Ireland, we could have a better... Once you get some sort of political consensus, and people's like, well, this is a bit dull. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, tell you what, let's break it down. Do you know what I mean? Like, and you find that...
It's not enough either, to push things forward all the time.
Yeah, the great thing about the conflict is it pushed people to try and think of ways of solving it. And now you've got this kind of stalemate situation where, basically, if we're being... Northern Ireland is all but at peace. Do you know what I mean? Like, but in many ways, it's nowhere near the society that was being the great sort of utopian society that was proposed around 1998, which a lot of people have lost interest, I think, as one of you point out.
Yeah, I don't even think it's a matter of like utopia. I guess what my research looks at is it's just failed on basic statutory duties that any kind of civic society should have, and I think that's kind of the issue that my research focuses on is why is that acceptable?
Isn't it fair to say that every society does that?
Yeah.
Well, I
of
think
course,
I was going to say that about your paper. You could fit what that paper was about. Like, well, there are a lot of people in Britain that are annoyed about social housing and things. One thing that's to note about Northern Ireland is the people who came in to set up that assembly had never any experience of being in Parliament. I was chatting to Sean O'Callaghan one time. He said, those boys from Sinn Féin didn't even know how to do a negotiation. They'd never been in a government. They'd never done it. You know what I mean? So you're getting plonked in now, and you've got issues like social housing, and previously you've never even been in the House of Parliament. You know what I mean? So it's been a steep learning curve, and they haven't really achieved very much in that sense. So I think that's worth bearing in mind as well.
Yeah. I don't want to steal the floor if there's other questions.
Can we go George then, and then we'll take a brace of questions.
Okay, I've got a question really for Liz directly. I thought that was really interesting reading the built environment and linking it to the agreement and shortcomings. I'm wondering if you could do that with other sites, if you thought about it with other white elephants in terms of Northern Ireland, Belfast. I'm thinking of the H-box.
Yeah, that's actually something that I was kind of looking at in a longer version of this paper. The maze is a perfect example too of that kind of horse trading, where it was actually asserted that the reason Sinn Féin backed down on housing at Girdwood at that time was because The maze was the trump card. If they backed down on housing, they'd get the maze, and that didn't happen. So then they had nothing, you know. And I think those kind of like political decisions do speak to kind of that proxy war of one side wanting more than the other. I mean, and then you have, you know, the whole other issue of the built environment, you know, that huge divide between the new Belfast and, you know, Troubles Belfast, where you have that 10-minute gap between city centre and North Belfast, where it's a completely different environment. And I think, you know, that was able to happen, and that kind of consensus was able to happen because those spaces were unproblematic to begin with. You know, it was like disused riverside kind of development. So I think, you know, in one sense, that's been a positive thing because there was no political dissonance in the first place. But then you have all these kind of contested spaces that just continue to, you know, create no positive impact. Yeah. But yeah, the maze is another good example.
What about the courthouse as well? Does that link into this at all?
It does. At one point, the courthouse, the jail, and Girdwood were all meant to be one development plan, but because they couldn't find consensus on social housing, Girdwood was kind of dropped, and they went ahead with the jail. Obviously, is now a successful tourist site and conference space. But yeah, the courthouse. I mean, I've heard it's been bought by a developer, but essentially it's just fallen into complete disrepair, which is, you know, really shocking, you know, looking at the architectural integrity of what that building used to be. So again, it's just an indictment of poor planning. And yeah.
I just wanted to ask, I found all three papers really fascinating, but I just wanted to ask, is the fundamental issue not the consociational system? Because the parties that actually negotiated the agreement had very different views. I mean, the DUP were actively against it. They didn't sign up to it. So we now got the extremes trying to work something which was actually developed by the middle ground. And, you know, people keep voting them in because there's no other alternative. And fundamentally, you know, I mean, Amy McCann made this fantastic comment that the Assembly had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. You know, because it will not work. And I lived, I've only just recently left Dolan, and spent many years making films for the BBC about it, covered the Gerber Barracks site. Really interesting to see how you followed on what happened, and also massively depressed because I was covering that at the time when
I think I've seen that actually.
It was actually seen as this kind of way forward. But at that time, the DUP and Sinn Féin wouldn't even do interviews with me about it. Like, so contentious was this idea that you might have shared housing on this site. And we've just kind of gone on and on from that. And so it, you know, I mean, I know we're not here to kind of decide what went wrong or work out how it's going to go forward, but it just seems that we are trying to fit a circle into a square box.
Do you just want to respond?
Yeah, about the you know, debates about consociationalism, whether it works or not work. I think even for those who support this consociational arrangement, that they would agree that it's not supposed to be something that lasts forever. It's not. It's supposed to be temporary, but how long? Maybe 2 generations. It's an open question, and I think I sympathize with them in the sense that I agree. You know, these so-called extreme parties, hardliners. It would be better if they just somehow try to work together instead of, you know, going to all-out war. And when you compare that to war, of course, it looks better, but it doesn't look very good from those who have emerged from atrocities and coming to a better mode of living together. And so I think, connecting to the earlier question about political leaders, it's Olive Forster, you know, has this or that intention. I think from the point of view of reconciliation, you know, grassroots, you know, it in a way it's irrelevant because what they try to get, let's say, try to win votes, at the end of the day reflects what they think they can gain from the voters. Meaning, if, you know, some let's say grassroots movements were able to convince political parties and their leaders that, you know, it is possible to make a leap of faith. It's possible to strike a different course of action. they might do it. So, but that has to happen only when they see that there's a possibility to survive the next election if I take this risk. And so I think the focus for the post-agreement period now, 20 years already, I agree with those who say that we need to move beyond just looking at consociationalism and try to make it work better as if it's some kind of machine, but try to look at ways to overcome it. Not to deny that it has made its contribution at a time when there was war, but now it needs more. I think that's the point.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly, I think also, there needs to be more of a, in a perfect world here, but there needs to be more of a space for pluralism and kind of civic identity. And I do feel like that's coming out with, a younger generation who are more concerned with issues like, pro-choice, equal marriage, the economy, all these kind of things, and don't really care so much about the past or about sectarianism. So I think, that's something that is, it's not a solution, but it is an element that was previously maybe not quite as strong. And I think, trying to be a bit more positive, that is kind of happening at a small scale. So
I think it is difficult. I mean, my students sometimes, when I was teaching at Queen's University, didn't even have the kind of understanding of how monocultural their backgrounds were, because actually they'd never even talked to somebody about that, because every single part of their life had led on, from the tradition that they came from. And it wasn't that they didn't like the other tradition, they just didn't know anything about it, to the point where they didn't even recognise that they were kind of in this post-conflict thing. So I think my worry is that there is a kind of a recognition of the kind of, bread and butter issues, to use that terrible phrase, but on the other hand, sometimes I think without a kind of understanding of what's gone before, actually it's not really taking things on, if that makes sense. Too depressed.
It's really a question, Martin. Unlike, I think, in post-war Germany, there isn't any real agreement, is there, in Northern Ireland, about who is the victim and who is the offender. And I wondered really, obviously there aren't any perfect international analogies, but I wondered whether you looked at post-Franco Spain at all, where, of course, there was no Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a pact of forgetting. In many respects, the bodies are still literally buried in Spain. But there has been, Spain does appear to be a fairly stable democracy, despite all that, despite obviously the Catalan separatist issue, which is not quite revival of the fundamental issues dividing Spain during the Civil War. And I just wondered really whether you thought it might be interesting to compare and contrast what has happened in Spain. And obviously EU membership has been significant there. And I think you also referred to John Hume and his vision really that EU membership in the longer term would help to reconcile the communities. And I wonder what Martin's thoughts were, but also what's the plan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. First point about comparing with post-war Germany. That's also a topic I had when I met with Adrian Guelka, and we sort of come to the conclusion that one major difference is there you had a complete defeat, whereas in Northern Ireland he said it was a truce, basically, and that makes a big difference when it comes to transitional justice, what is possible to pursue, and what is not possible in a political compromise. Relatively speaking, the things about justice and truth can be pursued in much less extent than when you have a complete defeat. But having said that, I think it's quite clear for those who look at post-war Germany, collective memory is that in the beginning they thought of themselves also, mostly speaking, as victims of Allied bombing, victims of Hitler, basically. We were fooled. We didn't know anything. And so on, and is a process of overcoming one's victimhood, which I find is something very interesting to look at, the German case. How and when this mass understanding of we are people of Täter or perpetrator became more dominant in universities, in the press, and so on. And there's a process there, and I think the optimism is not too long ago, a scholar looking at the so-called hierarchy of victims in Northern Ireland also tries to address that question. How can we overcome that? Unionists prioritizing their victims and Catholics doing the same and so on. And I think in terms of doing comparative research, what is interesting to see how others were able to overcome the victim was this. That's one point. And about another point about Spain is I consider that I don't know much about that case, but then in peace studies, I think there's a very useful concept which is unjust peace. There can be peace, but it's unjust. It's the tension between justice and peace is something that is I think constant in a lot of post-conflict situations, and the theory is that with unjust peace it will not last. It's just a matter of time that the past comes back. So if post-war Germany is any kind of model to offer, it is better to deal with the past early on rather than letting later generations to come back to this and asking their parents, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you tell us about it? That would be even more hurtful. It is always better to try to achieve reconciliation with truth when the survivors are still there, rather than it is too late to do.
It's funny that that would sort of almost be that kind of British model, you should deal with the past, but you can go into those archives and there's still things blacked out relating to the Fenians, and they'll never be not blacked out. So I mean, maybe practice what they preach there. But I think one thing about that Hume model, and I think the Spanish case in Europe, that is a very good counterpoint to what you're thinking about there. The Hume model, everything that kind of Hume believed in is kind of the opposite has happened. Hume believed that EU integration would lead to sort of peace in Ireland. Ireland would naturally just outgrow the border via EU integration. Borders and walls and partitions were kind of the world was doing away with them. And now you've got that Britain has left the EU. You've got Trump trying to build a wall. And, you know what I mean? The whole kind of global shift. And God love the man. That he kind of maybe he's not really with it these days. What he must think of the world that is around him now, because his whole political ideology that has been massively celebrated and massively eulogised has basically been proven wrong by recent events. Ireland and Britain were supposed to get closer through EU membership, and now they've decided to leave, and it's kind of upset the agreement of which he was key architect. So, I mean, it's just the different circumstances. But one thing that came across, I think, for all three papers was, particularly yours, Martin, was that I think people confuse the term peace with reconciliation. They tend to elide the two terms, that basically peace is reconciliation, and maybe that was Hume's influence and the Blairite influence, where everything had to be great and everyone was going to be everyone's best friend. But what you had in Northern Ireland was a truce situation, where you just had a peace agreement that basically was there's no more violence, or at least took the sting out of the violence. Didn't actually mean reconciliation, and I think those terms, actually the way we use them, probably need to be clarified a wee bit more. Peace doesn't mean reconciliation. I think that's fairly obvious from Northern Ireland right now.
Okay, so we have about 18 minutes before the break. 18 minutes of break at this point. Would people prefer, should we draw an end to that? All right, in which case, can anyone join me in applause and thanking our wonderful panel?
It's very clear what you want to say.
Thank you.
And it's a very specific case. About
But
using
that is the
words without
challenge,
shared states.